The crystal glass tapped softly against another. Blink! The entire ballroom fell silent. A 4-star general slowly rose to his feet. He lifted his glass. His eyes swept across more than 200 military officers, Pentagon officials, and defense leaders gathered in the room that evening. Then he spoke. Please join me in a toast. A brief pause. To Valkyrie. No explanation. None was needed. A second general stood, then another. The sound of chairs scraping across the floor echoed through the ballroom, one after another. Within seconds, more than 200 people were standing. Beside me, Richard froze. The bourbon glass stopped halfway to his lips. He blinked, completely forgetting to take a sip. Then, the general looked directly at him. So, all these years, you never knew. Richard stiffened. The confusion on his face was impossible to miss. He had absolutely no idea what the general was talking about. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 62 years old. I served in the United States Army for 31 years. But this isn't a story about rank, and it isn't about classified missions. It's about something much quieter. The moment you realize, the person who once understood you better than anyone, has slowly forgotten who you really are. When we were young, Richard was proud of my service. Every time I deployed, he was always the one standing at the front door, saying goodbye. Back then, I truly believed that, even if no one else understood me, my husband always would. But change rarely arrives all at once. It happens so slowly, you don't even notice it's happening. After I retired, Richard became increasingly well known in the defense consulting world. He started bringing me to formal galas, policy dinners, fundraisers. Whenever someone asked what I'd done, he answered before I could. My wife worked for the government. The first few times, I almost corrected him, then I stopped trying. Not because he was right, but because I'd grown used to letting people misunderstand me. There was one birthday. Our daughter blew out her candles without her mother beside her. I called from halfway around the world. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. She laughed. Promise you'll be here next year, Mom. I promise. I meant every word, but I missed that one too. A week before the gala, Richard handed me an invitation. Come with me. Just 4 simple words. But somehow, they made me realize something. At some point, I had stopped being someone who belonged there, and quietly become someone accompanying him. That evening, just before we walked into the ballroom, Richard straightened the lapel of my jacket, then leaned in and whispered, "Just stay beside me." I didn't argue, I simply looked at him, because I already knew, in less than 20 minutes, the very people he respected most were about to remind him who I really was. If you're still here, leave a 1 in the comments. I'd genuinely love to know how many of you will stay with me until the end, because what happened over the next 20 minutes changed our marriage forever. Richard seemed to know almost everyone in the room. Every few steps, someone called his name. Handshakes, laughter, conversations about defense contracts and Washington politics. I stayed quietly beside him, smiling when it felt appropriate, remaining invisible the rest of the time. A retired Army colonel turned toward me. "What unit did you serve with?" I had barely opened my mouth when Richard smiled. "My wife worked for the government." The colonel nodded politely. "I see." Then the conversation drifted somewhere else, as if that answer explained everything. There were so many times I wanted to tell the truth, to say, "No, I didn't just work for the government. I spent more than 3 decades serving my country." But once again, I stayed quiet, not because Richard was right, but because I'd spent years letting people believe the easier version of my life. When our daughter turned 8, the birthday cake had already been cut, the candles were gone, and I was sitting inside a windowless room, nearly 6,000 miles from home. That phone call lasted exactly 3 minutes. She smiled through the screen. "Promise you'll be here next year." "I promise." And once again, I broke it. I picked up a glass of champagne and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. Washington shimmered beneath the night sky. Lights stretched toward the Potomac. I caught my own reflection in the glass, and suddenly remembered something my very first commanding officer once told me. The best intelligence officers are the ones who finish the mission without anyone ever knowing they existed. Maybe I'd simply become too good at that. Across the ballroom, an older man with silver hair lowered his glass. He started walking, then suddenly stopped, his eyes locked onto me, without blinking, as though he'd just seen someone who shouldn't possibly be there. He tilted his head slightly, studied me for another few seconds, then his gaze dropped to my name tag. Evelyn Carter. A faint crease appeared between his brows, as if a memory buried decades ago had suddenly found its way back. Richard never noticed. He was still laughing, still talking, completely unaware. The silver-haired man adjusted his jacket, set his drink on a nearby table, then began walking toward me. Every step made my heart beat a little faster, because by then, I'd recognized him too. General Thomas Grayson, the man I hadn't seen in more than 20 years, and I knew, the moment he stopped in front of me, Richard's life was about to change forever. General Thomas Grayson stopped in front of me. He studied my face for a few quiet seconds, then he smiled. It's been a long time. I looked at his silver hair. A small smile found its way to my lips. The last time we saw each other, you still had black hair. He laughed. And yet, you kept your promise. I didn't ask what he meant. He didn't explain. He didn't have to. That single sentence brought back more faces than I could count. The faces of people who never got the chance to grow old alongside us. I nodded. I did. I never expected to see you here. His smile softened. Neither did I. We shook hands. Nothing more. No dramatic reunion, no long conversation, but somehow, that handshake alone was enough to make several people nearby turn and stare. Richard stepped forward. He politely offered his hand. It's an honor to meet you, General. General Grayson shook it, courteous, professional, nothing more. Richard smiled politely. Maybe. He thought the conversation was about to shift toward him. Instead, the general turned right back to me. I'm glad you came. Tonight. I think you'll find this evening worth remembering. I simply answered, I hope so. Richard stood beside me. His eyes moved from the general, back to me, then back again. I knew exactly what he wanted, an explanation, but I stayed silent, and so did General Grayson. Just then, the MC stepped onto the stage. The lights throughout the ballroom dimmed. Guests gradually returned to their seats. General Grayson adjusted the cuff of his jacket. He looked at me one last time. We'll talk again. I nodded. Yes, sir. Then he disappeared into the crowd. Richard watched him until he was completely out of sight. Finally, he leaned closer. You know him. We served together. I kept my answer short. Years ago. That's all. I pulled out my chair, sat down, spread the dinner napkin across my lap, as though we'd just shared an ordinary conversation. But Richard didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on the general. The bourbon in his hand was still untouched. For the first time that evening, he had forgotten to drink. The microphone crackled. Ladies and gentlemen, our program is about to begin. The ballroom slowly fell silent. Across the room, General Thomas Grayson rose to his feet. He wasn't looking toward the stage. His eyes found me. Once again. The lights dimmed even further. The MC smiled. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. The light applause filled the ballroom. People settled into their seats. At one of the front tables, General Thomas Grayson quietly set down his wine glass. He straightened his cuffs, then stood. He had taken only a few steps, when a three-star general reached out his hand. Thomas. Grayson shook it once. Excuse me, and kept walking. A few yards later, a former Deputy Secretary of Defense called after him. Thomas. He acknowledged him with a brief nod, but never stopped. Then the CEO of one of the nation's largest defense contractors stepped into his path. General Grayson, I'd like to, another time. The smile on the general's face never faded. Neither did his pace. Richard frowned. Where's he going? No one answered. The sound of polished leather shoes echoed across the hardwood floor. Click. 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 With every step, another conversation faded, another head turned. No one understood. What could possibly be so important that a four-star general would walk away from every handshake waiting for him? I remained perfectly still, both hands resting quietly on my napkin, my eyes fixed on the stage, as though, Toline, I had no idea. He was walking straight toward me. Richard looked at me, then at the general, then back at me again. For the first time all night, the confidence in his eyes was gone. In its place was a question. Who was the woman sitting beside him? General Thomas Grayson stopped, right in front of our table. He stood perfectly straight. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He didn't offer his hand. A strange silence settled over the ballroom. I slowly looked up. Our eyes met. For the first time, in more than 20 years. Then General Grayson smiled. He drew himself to full attention, and raised his hand, not for a handshake, not for polite conversation. He rendered me a formal military salute, perfect, precise, filled with unmistakable respect. I rose from my chair, and returned the salute. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. Every eye in the ballroom was already on us. Richard stood frozen. His gaze bounced between the general and me, unable to make sense of what he was seeing. In 35 years, he had never witnessed a 4-star general salute another person with that level of respect. General Grayson lowered his hand. He gave a small nod. I'm glad you finally came. I smiled. It's been a long time, General. He chuckled. Far too long. Then he leaned in, just enough for only me to hear. It's time. They all learned the truth. I met his eyes and nodded. Yes, sir. General Thomas Grayson turned and walked calmly toward the stage. This time, no one tried to stop him. Richard remained standing, watching the general disappear toward the podium. Then he looked back at me. But this time, he didn't ask another question. Maybe, for the first time in 35 years, he understood that someone else was about to tell him the story I never had. Please join me in welcoming General Thomas Grayson. Polite applause filled the ballroom. Richard clapped along with everyone else. He took another sip of his bourbon, then smiled. I'm guessing it'll just be the usual opening remarks. I said nothing. General Grayson stepped onto the stage. He carried a prepared speech. He looked down at it for a moment, then quietly closed the folder and set it aside. He never opened it again. He never read a single word. He stood there in silence. 3 long seconds passed. The room gradually grew still. Richard frowned. Slowly, he lowered his glass to the table. Tonight, the general's voice carried across the ballroom. I don't want to raise a toast to rank. A pause. And I don't want to raise a toast to titles. No one moved. Tonight, I want to raise a glass to Valkyrie. Richard frowned. Valkyrie? He repeated the name under his breath, as if it were buried somewhere, in the deepest corner of his memory. A chair scraped across the floor. A lieutenant general stood. He came to attention. He didn't applaud. Another chair. A female admiral rose. A third. A former deputy secretary of defense. Then a fourth. A fifth. And another. Within seconds, the sound of chairs echoed throughout the ballroom, one after another, until it seemed to come from every direction. No one gave an order. No one asked anyone to stand. Yet somehow, everyone did. Richard looked around the room. His hands tightened around his glass. What is happening? He whispered. No one answered. I remained seated. My hands rested quietly on my napkin. I didn't stand. I didn't turn around. I didn't speak. General Grayson lifted his glass. For the first time all evening, he looked directly at me. To the woman. Another pause. Because of whom so many of us in this room are still here today. He said nothing else. No stories. No medals. No rank. He simply raised his glass. To Valkyrie. In that moment, I wasn't looking at the general. I was looking at the faces standing before me. Some wore silver hair now. Some leaned on canes. Some quietly raised their hands in a crisp military salute. There was no admiration in their eyes. Only remembrance. The look shared by people who survived. Thinking about those who never came home. The first lieutenant general lifted his glass. Then the admiral. Then another. And another. In an instant, more than 200 glasses rose together. The applause erupted. This wasn't polite applause anymore. It wasn't ceremony. It sounded like a debt, carried in silence for decades, finally being repaid. Richard was still standing, but his arms hung at his sides. The bourbon glass remained frozen in his hand. For the first time, he didn't know whether he should raise his glass or lower his head. If you're still with me, thank you. Because what haunted Richard the most wasn't that standing ovation. It was the very first question he asked me. After we walked out of that ballroom, the applause still echoed through the room, but the ceremony was over. Guests slowly rose from their tables. Small groups drifted toward the exits. Richard remained beside me. The bourbon in his hand was still untouched. For the first time that night, he'd completely forgotten to drink. A lieutenant general approached us. He smiled warmly. It's good to see you again. We shook hands. Thank you, General. He nodded, then quietly moved on. Moments later, a female admiral came over. We've been waiting for this day for a very long time. She rested a gentle hand on my shoulder. I honestly thought we'd never see you at one of these events again. I thought so too. We shared a small smile. She squeezed my shoulder, then walked away. Less than 10 seconds later, an elderly officer with silver hair stopped in front of me. He came to attention and rendered a perfect salute. I returned it. Neither of us spoke. He smiled softly, then left. As soon as he was gone, someone else stepped forward. then another, then another. No one stayed long, no one revisited old missions, no one told war stories. They simply wanted to say hello, in person. Richard stood right beside me, but no one asked his name, no one offered him a handshake, no one introduced themselves. For the first time that evening, he was the invisible one. I glanced toward him. He hadn't moved. His eyes followed each person as they walked away, as though he were trying to piece together a story he'd spent 35 years, without ever realizing he'd missed. The ballroom slowly emptied. The conversations faded into the distance. Only the staff clearing tables remained. Richard took a slow breath. He turned toward me. Ev. He stopped. The rest of the sentence never came. Just then, my phone vibrated. I looked down. A single message. Colonel Carter. Thank you for coming tonight. I locked the screen and slipped the phone back into my purse. Richard had seen it. Every word. He didn't ask about it, not because he wasn't curious, but because, for the first time in his life, he was afraid of the answer. We walked together toward the parking garage. Neither of us spoke. Only the cool night wind drifted across the stone steps. The silence between us felt heavier than any argument we'd ever had. In 35 years of marriage, the car pulled out of the parking garage. Neither of us said a word. A light rain tapped softly against the windshield. Steady, gentle, quiet enough to make the silence between us feel even louder. Richard kept his eyes on the road. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles had turned white. After several traffic lights, he finally spoke. Evelyn. I turned toward him. Yeah? He took a slow breath, as if he'd rehearsed 100 different questions. But when the words finally came, there was only one. Valkyrie. Was that your call sign? I looked out the passenger window. Yes. The silence returned. Richard nodded. He didn't ask anything else, not because his curiosity had disappeared, but because, for the first time, he realized that in 35 years of marriage, he had never been asking the right questions. When we got home, Richard didn't turn on the lights. He didn't switch on the television. He didn't check his phone. Instead, he stood quietly in front of the bookshelf. His eyes settled on a small wooden box, resting on the highest shelf. It had been there for years. I'd never hidden it. He'd simply never asked about it. Richard reached toward it, then stopped. He turned to me. Would it be okay if I looked inside? For the first time, he was asking permission. Before stepping into a part of my life he'd always assumed he already knew. I nodded. Yes. He lifted the lid. Inside, there were no medals, no commendations, only a handful of old photographs. He picked up the first one. 8 people, none of them wearing pressed dress uniforms. Their faces were streaked with dust, but every one of them was smiling. He turned the picture over. Only one handwritten sentence appeared on the back. We all came home because of Valkyrie. Richard read every word, slowly. He reached for the second item, an old letter. The paper had yellowed with age. He started to unfold it, then stopped. Should I read this? I looked at him for a long moment, then smiled. I think, this time, you finally asked the right question. Richard lowered his eyes. He nodded once, then carefully placed the letter back into the box. He didn't read it. He didn't rush to find answers. That night, for the first time in years, Richard stopped trying to understand my past by searching for answers. Instead, he began learning how to wait until I was ready to tell him myself. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The house was still quiet. Only the smell of freshly brewed coffee drifted through the kitchen. When I came downstairs, Richard was already there. His phone sat untouched. His laptop remained closed. He was simply standing beside the dining table. The moment he saw me, he pulled out my chair. Without saying a word, I stopped for a second. 35 years. It was the first time he had ever done that. I sat down. He placed a mug of coffee in front of me, exactly the way I'd always liked it. No sugar, just a splash of milk. We ate breakfast in silence, but this silence didn't feel anything like the night before. When breakfast was over, I went upstairs. A few minutes later, I came back down. The old wooden box rested in my hands. Richard looked at it, then looked at me. He didn't reach for it. He didn't ask. He simply waited. I placed it in the center of the table, then gently slid it toward him. This time, I want to tell you myself. Inside, there were still no medals, no awards, only faded photographs, a carefully folded flag, and letters. Some had been opened countless times, others Toferned, had never been opened at all. I picked up the first photograph. 8 people, all smiling. I pointed to the first face. He never came home. My finger lingered there, then moved to the woman beside him. Neither did she. Richard said nothing. Neither did I. Only the steady ticking of the old clock on the wall filled the room. When I finally closed the box, Richard drew a long breath. I used to think the greatest thing about my life was knowing important people. A sad smile crossed his face. I was wrong. He looked at me for a long time. I spent 35 years living beside the person I'm most proud of. I didn't answer. I simply smiled. That afternoon, Richard stood on the back porch, talking on the phone. I couldn't hear the whole conversation, only one sentence. This weekend, a good time for everyone to come home. A few minutes later, he walked back inside. The kids are coming. I nodded. I didn't ask anything else. He walked over to the small table in the garden, paused, then quietly pulled out the chair beside him. The very same chair he'd never once pulled out for me in 35 years. I walked over and sat down. Richard sat beside me. Neither of us spoke. The early autumn sunlight settled gently across the garden. A soft breeze stirred the trees. Richard turned and looked at me. I looked back at him. For the first time in many years, neither of us needed another explanation. Everything that mattered already existed in the silence we shared. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If this story made you think of someone you've unintentionally overlooked, spend a little extra time with them. Don't wait until the rest of the world tells you how extraordinary they are before you truly see their worth. Until next time, I'll see you in the next story.